Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Carolyn Dubey. She's Principal Solutions Engineer and Cybersecurity Lead for Cloudera. Good to have you with us, Carolyn.
Hey, Tom, how are you? Great to be here.
All right. And, this whole idea of where cybersecurity is moving, all roads seem to lead to data. It's either data that's compromised, data you're trying to protect, or data that you gather to understand what's happening in your environment and to understand the cybersecurity threats. And that's what we're going to concentrate on today. And these data sets can be large, network logs and Lord knows what else coming from multiple sources that agencies need to evaluate. What do you consider the best practices now for aggregating that data in some cogent fashion so that it's available to understand what happens or what could happen?
Thanks, Tom. That's a great question. So, there are a number of different problems that we face in cybersecurity. The first is that we have a number of point solutions. There are many different solutions that we have in the cyber landscape. Each company or organization has a plethora of security products out there. But the problem is that each one is really great at doing what it's good at, but there's no way to get the overall picture of what is going on in all of these different products. And they all have slightly different interfaces. They all present data in a slightly different way. You have to do a lot of swivel chairing to find out what you're looking for. So, we really want to be able to bring all of that data into a common location and normalize it into a consistent format so that we can go across all of these different tools and piece together the string of what happened. So that's one problem. Another problem is that we have a lot of data. So we're talking terabytes of data a day. So how do you take all of that data, crunch it up, and then put it into a manageable, scalable platform? And then how do you secure the data? So when you start to put together all of this information about the different formats and all of your network, and you start to enrich and you have basically everything in one place, it becomes an area that would be really great for an attacker to get their hands on, right? Because they could go in and they could find out all of the information about your network. So we want to make sure that it's secure and that we are keeping it, with security and governance.
All right. So that sounds like some form of data lake, but I think in earlier generations of computing, the idea of gathering all the data in one place was daunting to IT staffs because they didn't want to have to build and maintain all of this storage infrastructure that would be needed for something that you really didn't know what the size limit on it might be, but at the end of the day. So it sounds like we're talking about a cloud solution, which is something that scales easily and yet it doesn't require the investment of capital that an organization would otherwise have to make.
So there are different ways to attack that problem. One is, the platform that we're using is scalable both on premise as well as in the cloud and in a hybrid solution. So, you can have a hybrid solution where you have your most recent data in a data lake on premise, and then you can push it up to the cloud, keep a very long context, because that is a major problem in the cybersecurity defense that we have today. A lot of the tools that we're using, SIM tools, or they're not scalable to the point where they can ingest all of the feeds that we need to ingest, but they're also not able to store that long context of data. So if we look at some of the breaches that have been occurring, the attacker goes into the network, compromises the network, and then kind of lurks around, kind of, feeling their way around in the network until it's time for them to take advantage of that and exploit that vulnerability or that intrusion that they've put in place. So we need to have a long context of data, and the tools that we have today are just not scalable enough to hold all of that. So, we have the scalability both on premise and in the cloud or in a hybrid configuration. So the hybrid configuration would kind of give you the best of both worlds. You'll have your hottest, most recent data on premise with really fast access. You put your data, your all of your entire context up into the cloud, and then you can spin up elastic resources that you might need to do those kind of bigger, more infrequent tasks. So if you had a big threat hunting story that you wanted to do, or if you had a large investigation where you needed to look at that data, you're not constantly looking at that very long context of maybe years worth of data, but you do need to be able to have it there and then be able to spin up those elastic resources.
So it's almost like a tiered approach into how you keep the data and how available it is in terms of speed and storage.
Absolutely. So you might even look at your different log, your different log types. And some logs you might want to keep around for a really long time. Some logs you might want to keep in an aggregated form rather than keeping, each particular granular log. You might want to aggregate them. So the platform gives you the flexibility to really decide for yourself how you want to store that data. And that's really important, is to have that open platform that gives you the flexibility that you need in order to do what your business or your organization requires.
In other words, you might have the immediate data that you need almost in a data pond, let's say, on premises, where it's your highest priority data. And if something happens, you've got the last 6 hours or the last 2 days of whatever it is, depending on the situation. But then organizations then may want to do long-term research. And what are the trends here? What are we seeing in the logs that might have clued us into this? And then you've got your lake that's off-prem, where that data is not needed immediately in a situation where you're under attack, for example.
That's right. There's a number of different cases where you would want to be able to have elastic access to that data. So, for example, if you're training machine learning models, if you're doing exploration for data science, you need to be able to have all of that information, potentially creating derivative work products to really understand that data. And then the other reason is if you have to do an investigation. So you have to do a really big investigation where you go back and you say, wow, I don't know how the intruder got into my network. I'm going to go back, 12 months, 18 months and see what happened. And then the third area is if you want to do some threat hunting. So you want to say, I want to go back and I want to look at what are the trends in the accesses of my users, or what has the server been doing over the last year or so, and how does it compare to others?
Yeah, so I can hear now what CIOs are saying. Well, golly, with all of this data lake in the cloud, how do I avoid my download of data costs, which are the big bugaboo often in cloud instances? But it sounds like the analytical tools could go to where the data is and return some kind of results. But that doesn't mean you have to download the data in order to do that threat hunting or whatever that long context activity might be.
That's right. So when you're looking at cloud, you're also looking at there's two issues really in taking data out of the cloud. One is it's less efficient. So you have to basically pull all of that data back, and then where do you put it once you get it there? And the second aspect is the cost. So it's usually more cost effective to process the data where it lives. So you spin up some elastic compute doing your machine learning using something like Spark, or one of the other elastic services to train your machine learning models, or do your data warehouse to do your data warehousing.
And earlier you mentioned keeping all of that data secure regardless of where it's housed. And let's talk a little bit more about what are some good strategies for making sure data is secure regardless of where you might house it at the moment.
That's really a very key aspect of managing this data. We have to have a security and governance strategy for the data. And the reason is that this data is critical from, we're making decisions day by day with this data, very critical decisions about the defense of the organization, and also legal as well. These have legal implications, the decisions that we're making. We might decide to investigate someone, from a legal standpoint based on the data that we're taking in. So it is critical that we have good security and governance. So the other aspect of that is the data privacy of protecting the data from, from usernames. If we have any specific, once we start to get into logs that are, audit logs, we want to make sure that we have all of our user data secured in a proper manner. So we have to know the privacy that we have to comply with. We have to identify the private data that we have, that we're collecting, and why we're collecting it. And then we have to basically mark it. And the our security and governance layers really help to simplify the security of this data and the governance of it. So the way that we do that is we separate this task into two different pieces. The first piece is we mark all of the columns and the tables that contain the private data. And that helps us to understand, what are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? Where is it? So that's the first step. And the second step is that we create policies based on these markings or metadata. And then what that does is it eases the burden of setting up these policies. So if you didn't have this mapping between the metadata and the policies, you would have basically a combinatorial problem, right? You'd have to go in, you'd have to recreate the same policies over and over. And when you want to change them, you have to change them over and over. So we simplify this because having a complicated permission system itself is a vulnerability, right? It's easy to make a mistake.
All right, and we're going to return to some more about protecting it and normalizing it after this break. My guest today is Carolyn Dubey. She is a principal solutions engineer and cybersecurity lead at Cloudera. I'm Tom Temin. This is Federal Insights, Cybersecurity Refresh Your Approach to Detection and Response, sponsored by Cloudera here on Federal News Network.